Right. Okay, first of all, I'd like to say welcome to all of you, because it's lovely to see a theatre full of people. It's the first large talk we've had for over 2 years, so it's really good that you're all here today. And I'm delighted, particularly delighted, to welcome Eleanor King, Lady Justice King, to speak to us today. Dame Eleanor is an old Margaretian, a former pupil of the school, and also a former parent. She sent all 4 of your daughters here, which is marvellous. And when I first started here, as well, many years ago, you were the chairman of the governors too. And I remember those first few parents' meetings, I was absolutely terrified.
I was too.
But as well as being the chairman of the governors and bring up 4 wonderful daughters, and I taught them all at some stage, didn't I?
You did.
In the outside world, Dame Eleanor has also had a highly successful legal career. After studying law at Hull, he became a barrister, then Queen's Counsel, and eventually a High Court judge in the family division. And that would be a spectacular career for anybody. And I'm sorry to say, it's particularly spectacular for a woman, because even now there are far fewer women at the top of the legal profession than there are men. So that makes it even more magnificent. Now, I know that there are some of you here who are interested in law, and I know that most of you here are women, so I think it's particularly appropriate you're going to talk to us about women in law and about what it's like to be a successful woman in a man's world. Thank you very much.
Thanks, William.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, it feels very strange to be back, but I'm delighted to be here. And like the rest of you, I'm sick to death of doing everything online. For nearly 2 years, we were hearing cases through Teams online. It was miserable, it was boring, and it was not very effective. So I hope this afternoon that I will be able to talk to you in a way that is a little more dynamic and a little more interesting than across a stream. So I've called this short talk A Woman Like Me, because it is a constant source of amazement, really, when I discover who I am now compared to who I was when I was at QM. Because my journey started here at Queen Margaret's, where I was a pupil for 7 years. So I don't know if you can see this properly, because I had to take a photograph with my camera, with my phone, from a scrapbook at home. But here we are in the 5th year. You'll be sad, really, that you're not wearing tunics in the 5th year anymore with ties. If you look at the very back row, I have put a red, can you see it on that? Oh, I think my techies tidied it up by taking the circle off. But on the back row, halfway along, there's a sort of tall, skinny person with a really bad haircut. That's me. And on the extreme left, also of the back row, is my closest girlfriend then and my closest girlfriend now. So even when the food was a lot worse and the teaching was terrible, QM, nevertheless, then as now, was a wonderful place to make friends for life. So here, ladies, is my first tip for the top. Hold your friends close. You'll make friends here like you'll never meet again. Never misplace them along the way on the altar of business or ambition or sheer laziness. You'll need them. Treasure them all your life, because there's nothing quite like having shared a dorm with someone to keep you grounded and to make you laugh. But I thought when I was thumbing my way through the scrapbooks that you might quite enjoy seeing what QM was like before health and safety was invented. So here we are. Here's the outdoor pool. Look at our magnificent diving board, before they were taken down because it was considered dangerous to dive. And here is what you would call the parsonage. And this used to be QM Lodge. And we lived there years, some of us, not all of us, for years 2 and 3, 4B and 4R it used to be. And we had a wonderful time there, and we were extremely happy, and we used to walk up and down to school every day. So I was at QM between 1968 and 1975. There were about 11 or 12 of us in the upper six. There was only 11 or 12 of us because there'd been a wholesale clear-out at the end of the 5th year, when nearly everybody departed to go to either cookery school or some sort of a finishing school. Only 2 of us, I think, went to university. When I was delving through the scrapbook for tonight, I found a list of the A-level results of those 11 or 12 of us, and they were frankly risible, really, really shocking. There was absolutely no help for anyone in applying for university, and by no help I mean no help. Nobody read even my applications through, let alone suggest where I should apply. I applied to Hull because one of the girls that did stay on had a sister that had gone to university. Shock, horror, probe. A brief discussion with their head teacher about Oxbridge for me, or applying to Oxbridge, was stamped on because in those days you did your Oxbridge exams the term after your A-level, so you came back to school for 1 term after you otherwise would have left. And I was told in no uncertain terms that I would not be welcomed back, as I'd been head girl and it might intimidate my successor. In retrospect, I was done a favour. I was wholly ill-educated, and I would have been given absolutely no support or extra coaching. And indeed, 45 years on, I still cringe when I remember my disastrous, mortifying interview at Bristol University. But it wasn't just that QM, along with many other schools, was an educational backwater, so different from now. But to put matters in context, only something like 4% of the population went to university, now something, I believe, in the region of 40%. And in my year at university, although there were over 100 in the year, I think only a handful were women, certainly under 10. Now, from time to time, during the course of my talk to you, I'll give you statistics about women and how things were, particularly in the legal profession, which, of course, is what I know about. And I'm telling you that, not to say, look at me, aren't I great, but to help you all to understand how things are so different now and what wonderful opportunities each of you have and how I urge you to seize them with both hands. So, again, for context, the Equal Pay Act only came into force in 1970, and it wasn't until 1975, the year I left school, that the Sexual Discrimination Act received royal assent. My earnings, such as they were in the early days, went on my husband's tax return. I was not entitled as a woman to file my own tax return. And when we wanted a mortgage to buy our first house, only half my earnings were taken into account because I would, of course, be stopping work when I had a family. So how on earth did I ever think I could become a barrister? Well, I had a secret weapon, and my secret weapon was my mother. My mother was a consultant pathologist. You don't need me to tell you how unusual it was in those days for a woman to be a hospital consultant, and pathology was even more unusual. I think there may have been one other girl in my year who had a working mother. As a consequence, it really, really didn't occur to me that it was going to be a problem for me to go to the bar, even though objectively I knew, of course, that it was a man's world. The male influences in my life, my father and an uncle, were very, very forceful in saying that if I insisted on reading law, I should become a solicitor. My mother said, follow your star. Luckily, I got in, sorry, this isn't quite like my one at work, I got into Hull. And my 3 years at Hull were incredibly happy, mostly, of course, because I met Mr. King there, to whom I've now been married for over 40 years. But the teaching was superb. I know it was superb because when I moved to London to do my postgraduate bar exams, which was a course populated substantially by Oxbridge with a smattering of Durham and very few women, unlike the feelings of a wholly academic inadequacy I'd felt on leaving school, those of us that had come on from Hull found ourselves to be extraordinarily well-grounded legally and flourished in the academic environment. I owe a lot to Hull, a university which in the 1970s and early 1980s was flourishing and on a par with universities like Exeter, a university which lost its way in the 90s before what I'm happy to say is a recent re-emergence. Hull have lauded me. They gave me an honorary doctorate. Terrible, terrible picture. And recently, they were kind enough to name a new state-of-the-art courtroom, which is to be used for moots and mock trials after me. Not quite such bad hair, but I look absolutely knackered, which I was. I am proud to have achieved what I have from such a starting point. So why, oh why, has it taken me all these years to stop feeling inadequate because I did not go to Oxbridge? I don't know if you can read that. Imposter syndrome. Congratulations to this year's recipients. Whoa, they're way, way more impressive. What am I doing here? Recognise and fight against imposter syndrome, ladies. It will sneak up on you when you're not looking. It will undermine you and prevent you from doing things that you should do. Men do not suffer from imposter syndrome, and it's time women did not either. So one of my top tips is don't be ashamed of your roots or think that your early life experiences will define you forever. They only will if you let them. So I was called to the bar in 1979, and it was still sufficiently unusual for a woman to be called to the bar for, believe it or not, to make the headlines in the Yorkshire Post. Woman amongst those called to the bar. This, then, is when I would ordinarily be talking to a group of young lawyers, students just called, or in the early stages of their professions, when I'd be telling you a couple of stories about horrible old Queen counsels pinching my bottom in all-male robing rooms. Oops. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to avoid the war stories, because what I want to do is I want to help all of you to look forward and to be conscious of how different things now are for women, and not to feel that the odds are wholly stacked against you. In saying that, I'm not for one moment pretending that misogyny is not alive and well and still out there, or that it's not hard to hold together a career and a family. But what you will not see now is the sort of interview I had when I was applying to join my chambers. I was sent along to speak to the then head of chambers to see if I could have a pupillage. That's the equivalent of an apprenticeship. After you've done all your academic exams, you then have to spend a period of time in a barrister's set of chambers doing on-the-job training, for want of a better description. I knocked at the robing room door, and the head of chambers, who was in the middle of a murder trial, came to the door in his full kit, robes, wig, etc. I stuttered and explained that I'd been sent over to discuss with him the possibility of me having a pupillage in his set of chambers. He looked me up and down. There was one other woman in chambers at that time. And he said, "You can come, providing you get on with Jennifer Kershaw. I'm not having any catfights in my chambers." And that, ladies, was my interview and my introduction and the way women entering chambers was regarded. The early years were not easy. The old school clerk, the man who was responsible for the distribution of work to the very junior barristers, wholly disapproved of women at the bar and told me in terms that he would not be putting my name forward for any work to instructing solicitors, because I was taking men's work away from them, men who had families to support, and what was a middle-class woman like me doing, working in the first place. So the time came when really it all did feel too much. And I decided I was going to leave because I was sure there was something out there that I could do. And clearly it was not the bar. So I had discussions with my husband, Tom King, and my mother. And they agreed between them. My mother said that she would fund me doing a medical degree, and Tom said that he would feed me. But I think they must have had one of those notorious pre-meeting meetings, which happen a lot in my world, because they then looked at each other and said that it was conditional on me giving it another year. I went back, and that is how I came to be a family lawyer, because I went back into chambers where nobody was willing to do family law, which was despised, and said that I would take on any family law going. And thus it was that I built up a practice and became a family lawyer. I have to tell you, after all these years, notwithstanding the fact I find it completely fascinating, it has provided me with the most magnificent career for which I am grateful. There is still part of me that is deeply resentful that the only way that I could get on was by taking on what was deemed women's work. So having settled down in 1981, I got married. And then between 1985 and 1991, as Mr. Grant's indicated, I was lucky enough to have 4 wonderful daughters. There was, of course, no such thing as a maternity policy. There was no such thing as maternity leave. I took 3 months off with each of the children, in fact, only 10 weeks with Margaret. So very different now. And this is what I will keep going back to, is how different it is now. Now, my daughters take a year off. I've got one on maternity leave at the moment, going back in June, and I've got another about to start her 3rd set of maternity leave in a few weeks' time. And then you have what are called kit days, keeping in touch days, so that you still have a sense of belonging and you go back. These are all statutory, they're all provided, and there's funding as well, to a greater, lesser extent. So very different, my own experience. When I arrived back after my miserable 3 months, I was told, oh, we weren't anticipating you'd come back. Women don't work after they've had babies. We've given your set place in chambers to someone else. And there he was, sitting at my desk. He gave it back to me. Those were grueling days, of course. I used to get up incredibly early to get a couple of hours' work done before the children woke up, and I made sure I was home for bath time, then working again after the children were in bed. Tom, at that time of his life, had his own firm of solicitors, so also was working incredibly hard. But I loved the work, which I found endlessly fascinating and stimulating. So in 1999, I took Silk, and that's becoming a QC, a Queen's Counsel. It was as much an excitement and pleasure for the family as it was for me. Certainly, Bug liked it. There she is, age 5, in my full bottom wig. And of course, because I was a woman, not a man, huge amounts of organisation to do to get the whole team down to London for the celebrations and the swearing in. And of course, because I was a woman, everybody had to help me get dressed. I was fortunate in Silk. Little by little, with hard work and some lucky breaks, I was brought to the attention of various senior judges. This was a case which the staff will recollect, I'm sure, because of the huge headlines at the time. But what this case was all about, I represented a white woman who'd been for IVF treatment. Now, IVF was still in its early days then and wasn't that usual. And what happened was there was a mix-up with the sperm when they were marrying up the sperm and the eggs to reimplant in the woman. And as a result, this white woman gave birth to mixed-race twins, the sperm of a black guy having been impregnated in error. It caused the most tremendous scandal and was extremely complex in law, made even more difficult on every level, given that the sperm donor, his wife, wasn't ever able to have a child, so far as I'm aware. And this white woman who had given birth to these children, the only way we could work it out to regularise in this strange, difficult situation was by her having to adopt her own babies. So my years in Silk were hard work and very interesting. There was quite a lot of travelling involved, and here again was a difference between the men and the women. I did quite a bit of work in Liverpool and Newcastle, and so each day I would travel home because that would mean I would still be home for 7 o'clock, and particularly during school holidays. That was, of course, what I wanted to do. And so as I jumped into the car to tear home in time to make the supper, the men were strolling back to the hotel, perhaps have a swim, or a game of squash, do a bit of work, meet in a bar for a drink, going to dinner before going to bed. And then I got up again at 5:30 to drive the hour and a half back to court the following morning. I'm not complaining. My relationship with my children was very different, and I think a lot more satisfactory, both for my children and myself, by dint of me having done that. I am firmly of the view, hard work though this all sounds, that life was easier for me as a woman than it is for many young barristers or professionals now. We had no email, no computers, we had small bundles, very little photocopying, and no mobiles. That meant nobody could get hold of me in the evenings or at the weekends. Just all of you, put yourselves at home for a moment and just think of your working parents. How often do they get work messages, work emails at the weekend, in the evenings, or whilst you're on holiday? None of that happened to me. In fact, I recollect we have a holiday home in Ireland because both Tom and myself are from Ireland. And for many years, we didn't even have a telephone. And then when we eventually got a landline, I just told my chambers that my number was private and I wouldn't be giving it to chambers. One of the only positives, however, that's come out of COVID, which I think will be hugely beneficial for each one of you as you move on through university and then into the workplace, has been the sea change that allows for more working from home. One of our daughters works in the world of technology. Now, there is a male-dominated world, if you like. Before COVID, if there was something called a night change, because as you'll appreciate, a lot of technology things have to be done overnight when the markets and the companies and the businesses are closed down for the evening. She would be expected to sit in her city office ready to deal with any crisis that arose as the techies were doing their techie stuff. All night she would sit there, often with never being called on. The company policy was absolutely no working from home. Now it's completely different. All those hours waiting in case something happened, a Corber-like, she now can spend at home with her husband. As always, nothing is that simple. It's complicated because as you get the advantages of being able to work from home, flexibility, taking your children to nursery, collecting them, shoving the washing on, chopping an onion, whatever it is that makes life easier when you're working from home, it's equally important, and I do worry about this, that young women do not end up having no profile in an organisation because they're rarely seen in the office when the men are going in and jumping up and down saying, pick me. After 10 years in silk, I thought that I had a couple more years in me. Mr. King disagreed. He didn't think I'd got more than a couple of minutes left in me. And I have to admit, I was pretty tired by then. I applied for the High Court bench and was appointed in 2008. Out of 119 High Court judges, only a handful for women, and I was, I think, there I am, getting my kit on, something like the fourth ever from the North East. It meant massive changes for myself and for us as a family. I changed my name. I'd practiced throughout under my maiden name, Eleanor Hamilton. And when I was appointed to the High Court bench, my girls said to me, "You don't need a trading name anymore, Mummy. We would like you now to become king and for us all to be a family together, and it can be recognised that we're all in this together." I found it hard, I admit, leaving behind the name that I'd worked under for all those years, but I've never, ever regretted it. The other great change was the High Court bench is a London job. And so, although we live in Yorkshire and still do, I now had to move to live in London during the week, 5 days a week. I became a weekly boarder. I certainly wouldn't have done that whilst my children were still at school. Frankie, the youngest, actually was upper six. I'm ashamed to say that she left QM for sixth form and went to Fettes in Scotland for her so that she could do international baccalaureate. I was reluctant, terrified, all of those things. Mr. King was pretty happy, though. Inevitably, I felt like the girl from the sticks at the beginning, but I finally found my feet and established myself. Well, I genuinely thought that was that. That young girl at bar school would never in a million years have thought that she would have ended up as a High Court bench. But time moves on, and after about 6 years, it was suggested that I might wish to apply to go to the Court of Appeal. And so in October of 2014, I was sworn in as a Court of Appeal judge, where I remain. When I joined the Court of Appeal, I was the 6th woman out of 36 Court of Appeal judges. There's now 10. We were such a rarity in those days that my inn, which is a professional body, of which there are 4, my inn is the Inner Temple, were delighted with themselves because out of the 6 women in the Court of Appeal, 5 were in our inn. And so they had a portrait painted of us, which hangs in the Inner Temple, much to our collective embarrassment. It's particularly embarrassing because if you imagine the high table there, and there's this massive hall of the old school variety that you can imagine, and this massive portrait is directly in front of you. Terrible. I love my job. The Court of Appeal is a very collegiate environment. We sit, 3 of us together, and I now find it extremely hard to imagine how I used to sit on my own as a High Court judge. The idea now of not having the other 2 to talk to and debate the case would be very, very frightened to have to do it on my own now. We come from all sorts of different areas of expertise. I am, as you know, a family lawyer, but with a particular interest in medical ethics. But I can be sitting with a commercial lawyer, an immigration lawyer, a tax or a judicial review lawyer, or a medical negligence lawyer. We talk, we debate, we bounce ideas off each other. Importantly, what you should know also is that we change our mind. We have the opportunity of reading the case papers ahead of time and have a meeting before we go into court when we talk about our preliminary views and where we have got to on the papers. But only this last week, we heard a case where our preliminary review had been very clearly that the appeal would have to be dismissed. We heard oral arguments and came out of court at lunchtime and said to each other, well, it's got to be the appeal allowed. I think the public find that a difficult concept to understand, that we really, really do go into court with an open mind when we hear these appeals. But it's not always plain sailing. The media and the pressure groups don't always like us and are keen to attribute personal views to one's objective judgments. I'm just going to show you a particularly horrible slide, I'm afraid. So there we are. That was when I was a High Court judge. You can tell it was High Court, not Court of Appeal, because there I am in red. And this was a pressure group that put this photograph of me after I'd had to do a case concerning a termination of pregnancy. But what you have to remember is free speech. Nothing should make us think more about that than what is going on in Ukraine at the moment, and what we hear about what the Russian people are being told and not told about what is going on. So, did I like that horrible picture? No, of course I didn't. Did it make me want to start trying to justify myself and say, read the judgment? It's not about me, it's not my views about anything, it's what the case was about. Of course it did. And of course I can't, because judges can never, ever respond. But what it does tell me is of the importance of open justice, of people being able to express their views, no matter if one agrees or disagrees with them. So the answer is trolling, absolutely not, and I've been a victim of that too. Free expression of views, absolutely. So what sort of work have I been doing in the Court of Appeal? Well, I'm going to just zip through these very quickly, but these are cases that, if any of you are readers of the newspapers, and certainly most of these you will have seen reported on television in the last couple of years. So this case, this vaccination case, now this was an important case because, as you will see at the bottom, it comes as scientists around the world work on a coronavirus vaccine. So this was a case I had to decide in the Court of Appeal when we knew that COVID-19 was out there and it was just in the early stages. And this was run as a test case to work out whether or not local authorities, when they have children in their care, can consent to the children being vaccinated, even if the parents oppose such a vaccination. It involved me also having to analyse and consider the law relating to vaccinations overall, and also to rehearse all the information and the medical analysis of a man called Andrew Wakefield, who was the lead and caused the start of the anti-vax movement in relation to the MMR vaccinations well before COVID. But the importance of that case, of course, was that then informed the law once the COVID vaccinations came through recently. Indeed, I was on call for the week. You do for a week, 24 hours a day for 7 days, last week, and we, late at one night, there was an application from a man who wished to prevent his daughter, who wished to have her COVID vaccination, from having this poisonous experimental stuff put in her. So that was at 11 o'clock at night. So that was an important case. This, can you see on the right? Well, it's, yes, you're right. This is demonstration. This is what I'm going back about, free speech. This was a demonstration outside court when I was sitting on the Charlie Guard. I think it was the Charlie Guard, or it may have been Alfie Evans. These are these tragic, terrible, terrible cases when young children have desperate life-terminating illnesses when the parents just simply cannot bear the medical treatment to be withdrawn. I've done a large number of them because I do a lot of medical ethics work. They're grim. They're absolutely grim. But you will have seen a lot of those in the paper. Very recently, the Tavistock Clinic, you will have all heard about that. That was the recent case called Bell and Tavistock, which was all about how consent is obtained from young people who have gender dysphoria and are considering, and their parents are considering, whether it's right for them to receive medication which is called puberty blockers as part of their development towards treatment for gender dysphoria. That, of course, was and remains a very controversial area for everyone. So then I had a little look at things that the tabloids had written about me, some of which pride wouldn't let me put up. This was a case, again, another sterilisation. This was a young man who was learning disabled to the extent that he was unable to consent to having a vasectomy. But he was well able to consent to having a sexual relationship, and he had a girlfriend who he'd met through a day centre that he went to, and they wanted to have a loving sexual relationship together. But neither of them could ever care for a child. And indeed, because they had no understanding of contraception, had already had a child which had to be removed and placed for adoption. And so the issue was the balance between his right to bear children and his right to have a private life and to have a fulfilling and happy sexual relationship. He was very clear he did not want any more children because he could understand they would be taken away from him. So in the end, he was sterilised. Now, this was the Al Maktoum case. You'll probably, if you're aware of this case, it'll have been through all the stories in the tabloids about the princesses having been abducted, one from a yacht and one by helicopter from a garden. And so this was quite extraordinary, where the mobile phone of the lawyer for the princess, who is now in this country with her 2 children, was hacked. But so too was Baroness Shackleton and a number of other solicitors and barristers, and very probably me. So the most extraordinary story was that the way this all came out, because Cherie Blair, it came to her notice in perfectly legitimate and appropriate circumstances, and she rang Baroness Shackleton, who she didn't know. But I should tell you this, although I can't remember whether I put this in the judgment or not, but Baroness Shackleton was sitting minding her own business in the bath after a hard day at the office with a glass of wine when her phone rang, and it was Cherie Blair. But you see, that's what I told you about mobile phones. Such a bad idea. Get phone calls like that when you're in the bath. To say that her phone had been hacked. It's horrible. It was very disconcerting for everyone to know that that was the case. So that was that one. And this is Shamina Begum. Again, you probably, even if you can't remember her name, you will have heard of Shamina Begum. She's the picture on the right is when she and 2 of her friends ran away to go and fight or join men and who were fighting in Syria. And they were 15. She's on the right. Her 2 friends were killed in the conflict. She, at the time this photograph was taken, was still only 20, by which time she'd had 3 babies, all of whom had died of malnutrition as she was living either before or while she was living in the refugee camp. Shamina Begum was stripped of her nationality, deemed to be a threat to national security. The case came before us because she's in a refugee camp, and it is accepted that she cannot conduct an appeal from there because she's no access to legal advice or anything of that nature. The decision of the court was that she should be allowed entry to the UK in order to in order to fight the case that she should have her nationality back, which was what she was arguing. She said that she should be allowed her nationality back. We said that she should be allowed in solely for those purposes, even if she was kept in prison while she did it. The Supreme Court said that we were wrong, and that as a matter of national security, she should not be allowed back into this country. So she remains in the refugee camp. So that's what I do, and that's what I've done. What I wonder is the law for any of you? I know it is for your head girl, who's going off to start to read law when she moves on. Don't know if you're having a gap year, but she'll be going on. So a lot of people think of law and they just think, well, if you're a solicitor, it's just doing house sales and purposes, conveyancing. And if it's crime, well, it's just, it's very exciting. It's all cross-examining murderers and rapists. Well, actually, law is, as a profession, is a lot more than that. And I've just put down as many as I could think of the various different areas of law. And there really is, whatever your interest is outside of the law, or anything your interest, there is an area of law which relates to it and can be pursued either as a bar. There's very specialist chambers for virtually everything you can think of: medical, sport, banking, tax, family, crime, or solicitors. And like everything else these days, there's subgroups of the subgroups of the subgroups. Well, it's very easy to be put off. We hear these desperate stories of the terrible hours that people have to work in the magic circle firms and the tier one sets of barristers' chambers. And of course, going to the bar or the solicitors is what everyone thinks of first. But do remember there are a myriad of other legal jobs that allow a more rational and regulated way of life. There's in-house lawyers. The government legal department is a very exciting and popular choice. There's compliance officers, and of course there's being academics. And I mention those just as a few of the alternatives, so don't work on the basis that it's a very narrow field. But let's look at the statistics, because we have got a way to go yet. So since 1990, women have represented over 60% of new entrants into the profession, but only December 2020, only 38.2% of women at the bar. And that's because there is a huge, huge attrition problem at the bar for women. The proportion of female QCs, as you can see, is small at 16.8%. And so far as solicitors are concerned, there are more women solicitors than there are men, but only 25% of partners, equity partners in firms of solicitors, are women. So what about diversity? Because that's currently the way it is. Well, all I can say to you is that I have a real sense that things are changing and that there is a real drive, and not just a drive because it's PC or people feel they ought, or firms and barristers' chambers are concerned that they're going to have to reveal their statistics and it's going to be reputationally damaging for them if they have to reveal them. I have a real sense that there is at last, you may say, a real understanding of the huge value and importance of having women at the very top of every profession, not just law. So we have to tackle the attrition rate. We have to tackle the challenge that there is for women maintaining their career whilst they have their families before they go back either part-time, job share, or full-time, depending on what they want. So these are just some of the various initiatives that are underway at the moment. And I, for myself, I am the chair of the Judicial College, which is the university that trains all judges of whatever level in this country. And at the moment, we are conducting a massive exercise into diversity, inclusivity, and bullying, with a view to updating and changing all our training to ensure that there is proper treatment of both women, of minorities, and that there's a proper recognition of the importance of everyone's role. So here are my top tips. Family and friends must always come first. You do not want to burn out. You do not want to find yourself at 38 going home, perhaps to some luxurious flat, earning shedfuls of money, and looking around and suddenly thinking, what have I missed? Or not having seen the dreadful thing you always hear, which makes me so sad, is, oh, well, I couldn't make it to my brother's wedding, or I had to cancel my holiday with the family because. That's no way to live. For the future, for all of you who you're going to, just at the start of your lives, who are going to be thinking about what you want to do and what careers you want to follow, just because something you're drawn to is different or unusual, it doesn't mean it's unattainable. Be left field, be maverick if it's what you want to do. Self-belief is not arrogance, but don't be stupidly naive. It's all very well to want to be an airline pilot, but actually it costs like £100,000 to train. There's virtually no scholarships or funding to do it, and guess what? It's COVID and all the airline pilots have been laid off. Next, ambition is good. It really is cool to be aspirational and ambitious. Ambition requires a combination of tenacity, hard work, and dedication. My experience of this school, not as a pupil, but when my children were here, when I was chair, and from my knowledge through my husband's work here and my continued association, is that it was always cool to work. It's cool and a good thing to do well, to have aspirations. And that makes this a very special place. Don't lose it, because enthusiasm means fun and interest, and it means you're not bored and not wondering what to do with yourself. Top tip 4, hard work is a given. Don't start looking for a career or a job or a route through that you think is not going to be hard work, because it really, really doesn't matter how clever you are. Whatever you want to do, you're going to have to work hard. And that's no bad thing, because it's worth it at the end. Trust me, it's worth it. Why would you end up in a dull, unfulfilling job if you can do something fulfilling and challenging? And all the more reason to go for it now. If you have a career break for children, you'll then have something to go back to when the time is right. And you have a career ready to be rebuilt or developed or continued, and not a sense of frustration that you didn't push on through in your 20s. So I've got 2 top tips from my techie daughter, Margaret, who has a tendency to tell us how it is. And she gave me a longer list, but I edited some of it out. But I think members of staff may have to cover their ears for a bit of this. So the first thing she said, because you'll remember she was at this school and she loved QM and is still, her closest friends are from QM still. The first thing she said is, you've had the massive privilege and advantage of being at a single-sex school. But now you have to get out there and get to know men. And what she means by that is that when you go to university, you haven't been in a working environment with the opposite sex until now. So join societies, join clubs which are mixed, get on committees with men, get to know men as friends, get so that you're easy and comfortable and you know the little darling's weaknesses before you start to enter the world of work, because you want to arrive knowing how to act around them, not feeling uncomfortable, which ties into Mog's second tip, which is this. There's plenty, she says, of misogyny out there, and I dare say there is in the world of technology. She says, but don't go looking for it, because what you've got to remember is that sometimes men are just dicks. Last week, some of the family, including Mog, we went to see an absolutely brilliant musical in the West End called Come From Away. And what Come From Away is set in 9/11, when a large number of planes, when they closed the airspace, had to be diverted, because obviously they couldn't go into New York, and they were into America indeed, and they were diverted to Newfoundland, where there was a massive airport which dated from the days when you couldn't get a plane all the way across the Atlantic without having to refuel. And so there was this barren airport left. So they, everyone, all these planes landed there, and there was something like 7,000 people suddenly on this tiny little island, which only had a population of about the same. And the musical is absolutely brilliant, and it's about just this snapshot of what happened during that time. But one of the characters is the captain of one of the huge planes that had to land. And her big song, her, in the whole of the musical, is this song called Me and the Sky. And I think I was thinking of all of you and thinking of coming here today. And so I thought again about the lyrics. So this was this young woman who wanted to be a pilot in rural America in days when it was a nonsensical idea. And she's talking about suddenly she's in the cockpit, suddenly she's got her wings. Now she's able to tell the other pilots, go and get your own drinks. I recognise that. When I first joined my chambers, one of my jobs was at Chambers tea, which happened after court every day, was that I had to serve the tea to all the members of Chambers and pour it out and carry it to them. And I had to do it in order of seniority, which meant, of course, that from day one you had to remember the order of seniority, let alone trying to put the names to their faces. So I felt this really resonated with me, being able to tell them they can get their own tea now. But suddenly I've got an all-female crew. That wonderful, wonderful day in the Court of Appeal, which actually was on the news at 10, I think, the first day that I sat in an all-female Court of Appeal constitution. No one's saying you can't, you won't. No one's going to say that to any of you. You're the new generation, and you can do it. So no one's going to say you can't do anything because you are a girl. So follow your stars and get out there, make the most of the fabulous education you get here and the huge advantages of single-sex education, and go out into the world and do precisely and exactly what you want. Thank you very much.